Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, Atheists in Recovery land, and welcome to episode 28 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today's episode is all about recovery through a holistic lens. Today's episode, I think you're going to like, in that we talk a lot about empowering yourself as the person that knows what they need the most in recovery. We talk about self-directed recovery, and we talk about a lot of different things, from childhood trauma all the way to starting to find one's spirituality in recovery. And so I hope you like today's show. It's not anti-AA, but it does give us a lot to think about as we think of what we want a recovery to look like. Today's guest talks a lot about food and how she used food to cope along with drugs and alcohol and sex. But food was something that was pretty difficult for her to tackle because there's a dearth of literature on food addiction, as you know. So let's move on to our guest today, Olivia Pinelli. Olivia is a writer, journalist, and recovery activist. Her work has appeared in Stat News, Filter Magazine, Insider, The Fix, Grok Nation, Ravishly, and Faces and Voices of Recovery. She's the founder of the popular website Liv's Recovery Kitchen. She lives near Portland, Oregon. Okay, here we go. Liv Pinelli, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so I'm so excited that you're here because I feel like you have a very interesting take on, well, your lived experiences are unique to you, but you write a lot about your recovery journey, and food is a central piece of that. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. Yeah, I write for a living, which is, and I do a lot of content work and help organizations develop their strategies around content. But essentially, I use my lived experience as part of that content. And yeah, that includes a disordered relationship with food. And I couch it in those terms because, I think we can pathologize addiction so much. I do use the term substance use disorder because I believe in using non-pejorative labels, because we know that there's a lot of bias around those labels. But I think when it comes to food and recovery as a whole, when I think about food, I think disordered relationship, even though I probably come within the technical definitions of eating disorders. So, and that predated my addiction. So I had used food as an escape to deal with a difficult childhood. And, I actually believe that food and substances aren't really my core issue. The real core of my difficulties is complex PTSD. And food, substances, exercise, sex, you name it, all of the things that we encounter typically in the continuum of recovery are just symptoms of how we learn to dissociate. And when I approached trauma healing, that was really when I got to grips with my PTSD and learned more effective coping strategies and dissociate more. However, before I got there, I went to a 12-step program for 5 years. And because they're certainly not within England, they are not very trauma-informed. In some respects, it made my PTSD worse. And I didn't know I had PTSD until I moved to America. So yeah, it was really challenging. And interestingly, I just reviewed a book this week written by Dr. Jamie Marich. She's a trauma expert, and she has written a book called Trauma and the 12 Steps for clinicians and for members of 12-step fellowships, which I think will be really helpful in updating the language, updating how we look at substance use disorders today, which are predominantly linked to trauma or a wound of some sort. So yeah, that was a really roundabout way of explaining that.
And I want to come back to the PTSD, but before we go there, I wondered if you could talk to us and to the listeners a little bit more about your spiritual background, maybe from childhood.
Yeah, and I wanted to add an extra point too about the food. And I write about this a lot. I think this is something I'm really passionate about, which you can probably tell from the tone of my voice. I think there is this tendency in the first couple of years of recovery to label ourselves as food addicts, sugar addicts. We experience this out of control feeling around food. We don't understand what's happening to us. We put on weight. We feel really uncomfortable. And we have this tendency to label ourselves in that way, look for another fellowship or another route of recovery to deal with that. But actually what's happening is we're not considering the physiological aspects of recovery. So, the fact that addiction severely impairs brain chemistry and physiological function, and it takes so long, we're talking years, for brain chemistry to go back to a normal baseline, if ever, and that's the core reason why, as well as, triggering PTSD, is one of the core reasons why people return to use, is because we have low D2 receptors. So we have a low amount of dopamine, and we are seeking dopamine and pleasure chemicals in other substances and people and all of those things. So if I could offer one piece of advice to anybody that is saying, I'm out of control with sugar, I'm a sugar addict, I would say just pause, give yourself a little bit of compassion. And before going on a ridiculous diet that excludes food groups, or, Overeaters Anonymous, or even worse, Grey Sheet Anonymous, just maybe check in with your doctor, see an integrative health physician if that's possible, and see what's going on in your body. Because actually, I believe that when we crave something, it's not something that should be feared. I think it's a warning signal. It's asking us for something. There is an unmet need in some way. So if you're craving sugar or high carbohydrate foods, your body's saying, I'm low in energy, or my brain chemistry's off and I'm feeling really low mood and I'm actually looking to boost. The body's a really intelligent organ, it's amazing. So yeah, that's what I would say about that. And then in terms of my spirituality, it's really interesting this. I was in the dog park this morning and I'd mentioned that I was going to come on this podcast today, and they said, well, are you an atheist? And I said, well, probably not. And they're like, well, you either are or you're not.
Not true.
Right. Right. I mean, we could have a whole podcast on this.
I know.
Right. But I think my conception of a power greater than me has changed considerably throughout my nearly 8 years in recovery. And at the very beginning, I was really off by the word God in the 12-step fellowship. And particularly, a male God. But I sucked it up because that's what you're told to do. And, I was invited by some women to look at what that might mean for me. And I actually started going to a church, and I found some hope in that, but I still didn't feel connected. It just didn't, I got the concept intellectually, but yeah, it didn't really resonate with me. So I just started to explore spirituality, and that meant, looking at female spiritual leaders like Rebecca Campbell, and be it the book she wrote, Don't Just Sit There. What a brilliant book about meditation, and just all of those practices that encourage women to look inward, as well. What is my intuition telling me? I think when you go to a 12-step fellowship, there is this, and I should say I am not anti-12-step fellowship at all. I believe it's a valid pathway of recovery, but I think that there is this tendency to be punitive towards our character. And actually, I think the converse is true for us. I think that we should trust ourselves. I think that we have a lot of information and we are the best to direct our lives. And, once we've established a period of recovery and, re-established safety with ourselves and have moved away from destructive behaviors around substances, I think that there's a lot of wisdom. And those spiritual leaders encouraged me to look within and see, through maybe pelvic bowl meditations or just sitting silently and listening to myself, what my instinct is telling me. And that's not really encouraged in that pathway of recovery. And I think they're really missing a step.
Yeah, maybe we can add one. The Liv's 14th step or something.
Just the U step, right?
The U step, the insight step.
Yeah. I mean, really, step 11, prayer and meditation, should
Mm-hmm.
be not necessarily looking to God, but looking within.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we have, especially as women, you know, men have their own wisdom too, but I think there's a real power in feminine energy. And clearly I've lived in Portland for too long now. But it's true, you know, Portland I've now moved away from Portland, but it really introduced me to myself in so many ways. And spiritually, you know, I learned to trust myself, but I also learned that with everything else in recovery, spirituality is fluid. You know, I don't think we should be so rigid in recovery.
It is fluid. And I think that, you know, whenever I specialize in working with individuals with substance abuse issues and eating disorders. And that's one of the questions that I ask men and women, you know, tell me about your spiritual background. You know, who's your higher power? Who's your wise self? And it's always something that they want to have an answer for right away. And you don't. And your answer today can be completely different when I ask it tomorrow. And I think that that's completely okay because it's a journey,
Yes.
you know? But I want to go back to your childhood and inquire about, you know, where you found that formative milieu. You know, what was that like for you?
What do you mean by that?
Your spiritual background.
I don't think I had any spiritual background in my childhood. I think I was very lost as a child. Despite my accent, I am actually from the US. And because of my father's alcohol use disorder, my mum took me to England. And that was really challenging for me. It really affected my relationships. I developed attachment disorders. That's when my PTSD, I believe, started. So, you know, there was a series of traumas in my life that really, you know, I only found spirituality when I found recovery.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was really challenging. And I think there's this tendency in England to brush emotions under the carpet and minimize negative experiences like trauma. Because even in the US too, you know, when we think about trauma and PTSD, we think about big traumas. Like
big traumas.
Right. Like, you know, being a soldier and going to war or being the victim of, you know, a sexual crime or something like that, which of course are really horrific traumas. But there are also complex traumas that are smaller, but consistently over time that have a similar effect, which are just as important. I believe actually now complex PTSD is in the ICD, the International Classifications of Disorders, but it isn't in the DSM yet.
Right. As far as I know, that's true. I try not to look at the DSM as much as possible, even though I am a licensed clinician. I don't like the disorder part of things. So
it's particularly helpful. I think sometimes it is looking at it from a framework, you know, what are the key factors of substance use disorders? But yeah, like anything that's diagnostic, it can be a little bit rigid.
Yeah. And everyone's experience is so different.
Yes.
You know, I've seen over 700 individual clients, not including groups. Wow. And, you know, every single one is so different. And I learned so much from every single person because, you know, like you said at the beginning, you know, you have what you need inside of you already. You know, you have the answers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe in a self-determined recovery. I think we just need guidance to get there. Yeah, we have the tools. Well, that's not true, actually. We have the wisdom. We just need the tools to be able to curate that wisdom into something useful and helpful.
So I want to share something that you wrote on your website that I thought was incredibly beautiful.
Oh.
Yeah. You say, in my first 2 years of recovery, I was ill, mentally and physically exhausted, and carrying around a 300-pound body. My life felt like it consisted of endless meetings in church basements, telling sad stories and working at a dull and meaningless job. I lacked any sense of purpose, and I felt completely lost. Each day was punctuated by uncontrollable food binges with calorie and fat-laden foods that provided only momentary relief, but were followed by long-lasting self-loathing. I couldn't accept this as a recovery that I wanted. It didn't represent a life of freedom to me. I certainly wasn't thriving. I was existing, just doing it without the anesthesia of 4 bottles of wine a day.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right? How miserable. That really wasn't a conception of recovery that I wanted.
Yeah.
It was miserable. So miserable. It's really funny, you know, something funny about it, but what I mean is in comparison, these last few weeks, I've been suffering pretty heavily with depression.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's been a number of compounding factors. This is the perfect example of us being very quick to label things and say, because we look at depression as a negative emotion, like, what are you doing to be depressed? Why aren't you grateful? Why aren't you, whatever? And actually, I've been to see my physician and my thyroid is low. So go figure, it's not about my mindset. It's about this. But, my point was, when I think back to that, it's so easy to get so wrapped up in what's going on situationally. But when I think back to my life then, and I realize the abundance of life that I have created now, I think a big part that is missing from 12 steps is the encouragement to go out and find your purpose. I think the purpose in 12 steps is service and carrying the message to the person still suffering. And I think that's important. We don't necessarily have to do that within the concept of sponsorship. I look at my website as an element of service, and my writing, because I might have published 700 articles in the last 3 years. Yeah, we both got 700, right? I might have done all of that, but I get below minimum wage for a lot of that work, and I've not had a vacation for 3 years. But my life is still way more abundant, even though I suffer with depression. I think deciding to leave that life and saying, there has to be more than this. And being really bold and really brave and selling all of my belongings and moving to America. Everyone said I was crazy. And in retrospect, it probably was a little out there. But it was the best thing I ever did. And, sharing my experience and, committing to ensuring that the information that gets out there about substance use disorders and recovery is valid, is informative, is evidence-based, and has the person's best interests at heart. I'm seen in the recovery community sometimes as anti-AA, which I'm not. I'm just anti-dogma, and I'm anti-promotion of there being only one pathway, and therefore anything outside of that is defective or wrong in some way. And I can't stand that really harmful messaging.
Tell us a little bit more about how recovery has helped you gain spirituality. That's so interesting to me.
I think recovery is a process of awareness, of increased awareness. That's how I look at it. And, we talk about revealing layers or taking away layers. And I see that as, each layer is a new gained awareness. And adding spirituality into that element helps me to see that I think there's this tendency in recovery to feel very lost, and even in addiction, where do I fit in the world? I was never really a popular person at school. I don't necessarily fit into certain groups. I've always been quite individual, and spirituality really helped me to connect to something greater, and that actually it celebrates. I was part of a bigger universe, but actually it celebrated individuality. So, I could be who I was and I still had a place. And, it kind of grounded me in who I am and helped me to celebrate my individuality. Yeah, and intuition. Yeah, because of that distrust piece. That's something I think is really harmful. This phraseology that, your addict isn't in the car park doing press-ups and, that kind of nonsense. I think it splits a person. They believe that they have this other identity living within them that wants to kill them. I don't want to live in that body. I think it's much more harmonious to celebrate who you are, faults and all, We all have them. We don't need to be afraid of ourselves. I think that's what spirituality gave me, is the permission to trust myself.
Yeah, I have this dark part of myself, but this is not the entirety of who I am. I am not an addict.
I'm not. I don't identify in that way. I identify as Liv. But with light comes darkness. They're two sides of the same, either side of the same coin. You can't have one without the other. And like depression in winter, that retreating, that is a time that we can nourish, and we're supposed to wind down a little bit, but freelance work doesn't really allow you to do that. But it's, a moment of reflection. And then the spring and summer is lightness. So, yeah, I see things in a very different way, I think. But the spirituality piece has really helped me to see myself and to celebrate that and not try and be something that I'm not, not try and confine myself to one belief system. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I never said that out loud. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, it's quite
There's
beautiful.
a blog post.
It's a blog post in the making. I did a podcast a couple weeks ago with Edie Weinstein, and she does a lot of writing and recovery. And interestingly enough, there are a lot of women that do the writing, but I'm sure there are men too. I just don't see them anywhere.
Yeah, there are. A great writer I love is Mark Goodson. He's a beautiful writer. Yeah, and Paul Furr is also a great writer. And who else do I know? A great journalist is Zach. What's his surname? I will find it. Elizabeth. She's got a blog. I'll send you the details. Elizabeth Bricko. She is incredible. Yeah. So there's a lot of us. And I think this is a piece that's missing in recovery is, this is process from a therapist perspective, right?
Oh, yeah. You're speaking my language.
Right? So this is a really important element of recovery. And I think it's missing in a lot of recovery. How do you process what's going on for you? And, I often, even though there are some writers that say this is a really bad idea to write in the heat of emotion, I believe the opposite. I think there's something really powerful in doing that because that's process, but it's also helping you, the processing of the emotion and conceptualizing what's going on. And for me, I write into a solution or into an understanding, and that's really powerful, and that can be used to help somebody else with their process. So if I don't write in the heat of emotion, I kind of lose some of the strength of my writing. One thing that people comment on about my writing, probably more often than not, is that I elicit emotion, and people can really relate to that. So, don't necessarily write angry posts and post them, but write it for yourself by all means.
Oh, please. Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
So this last couple of weeks, there was a blog post of a woman who said we need to stop bashing AA. And it was really poorly written. It compared breathing to AA. The comparisons were really like, oh, so I'll not breathe. Breathing isn't a sport. It's kind of essential to life. But she made, there is this kind of I coined this phrase. It's called AA fragility. And, I believe that anybody that makes a constructive criticism kind of falls within that. And to be fair, there are a lot of criticisms that aren't constructive and bashing and all of those things. And so she'd said, we shouldn't do that. And it was really emotive and factually incorrect in a number of ways. And another woman wrote a response to this, and her blog was amazing. She conceptualized some really pertinent points that constructively criticized this other person's blog. But what she did is she added a sense of humor to it. And whilst it was really funny, that sense of humor kind of undermined her point because it bordered on sarcasm and satire. So I feel like it could have been way more powerful. So getting back to my point around emotion is, yes, it's a really important point of process, but just be cautious of that emotion coming through and not detracting from the power of what you're saying.
So I've read that writing for you really helped your recovery. What would you say to someone that has never written before in their life? How do you begin?
That was a question I asked when I was just sort of with my first month of recovery, and my sponsor said to me, I think you should start writing. And I looked at her just totally perplexed, well, what should I write? How? I don't know what. And it's interesting because for the previous 6 years, I'd been a writer for an organization for a living, but it was legal writing. It wasn't writing about yourself. And she said, well, why don't you start by writing your plan for the day? And, use it as an opportunity to reflect on what's going on in your brain. What are your thoughts and feelings when you're waking up? What's concerning you? And then at the end of the day, and this was the most important thing and still is today, she said, I suggest that you write the things that you've done right that day. Because there is this tendency in recovery to, well, it's a step, isn't it, to inventory our defects.
Oh, yeah.
And I say flip that on its head and write about what you're doing right, because I don't believe in deflating ego. I think, and Holly Whitaker has said this in a recent book, that, women have no ego when they come into recovery. We are broken.
Yeah.
We don't need any further deflation because we're already in the gutter. So self-esteem building is essential to recovery. And this is a practice that can start you writing, but it can also rebuild your self-esteem. So, and I used to say this to sponsees, and I say it to people now. I don't sponsor anymore. I would say, if you don't know any, I'll give you 5. Here's one, you're sober today.
Yeah.
Here's another, you're right here. You've showed up for yourself and for your recovery. You've moved today. You've moved your body. You've nourished yourself. Once you start doing it, you actually got 20 or 30 things that you can write down every day. And doing that before going to bed is really helpful. So that's how my writing started. And then it became processed. Then I would write about experiences and, as I really feel my writing, when people look at me writing, they're like, oh my God, what's going on? I'll be moving around and, angsty. And I still like that today because I am processing to a solution.
Nice.
Not always, but sometimes.
Processing towards a solution. I like that.
Writing is really powerful.
Yeah.
It's one of our greatest tools if you are able to do that. If you don't want to write, you could record something. You could call a friend. You could, if you're able to, have therapy. But I think, you might know this. I wonder if writing accesses a different part of the brain than speaking.
Yeah, I feel like you're not taking the emotions you're not putting so much meaning on the emotion when you're writing it versus speaking. Like, I feel like when you're writing it, you're identifying the emotion, you're opening the door to the emotion, and then you're letting the emotion leave out the back door. You're not inviting it in for tea. Let's swim in this a little while. It's like, oh, that's interesting. That's something I wasn't expecting, that fear emotion or that shame emotion. All right, I'm done with you now. I've acknowledged you and now I'm done. You can leave.
I think there's something different too in how we write. The pen on paper versus the keyboard. People say to me, how do you write? What's your process? There really isn't one. I don't sit there and I don't structure an essay. I think it would really probably help me if I did. But because it's my process, I just put my fingers on the keyboard and I see what happens. And a lot of people can't get their head around that. In the same way as picking up a pen, but it's easier for me to use a keyboard because I type more quickly than I write. It's just easier. But yeah, it's a really powerful tool. And actually, I let it go from time to time and I really fall back in love with it every time I start again. There's a whole practice, there's kind of a ritual. That's what spirituality gave me, is kind of ritual and meaning. And, writing as ritual, it kind of cements either side of the day, so I'll sit in front of I have this little meditation cushion and I have my spirituality books and I'll sometimes light a candle and I'll meditate, I'll write, I'll read something, and then I might stretch or something. It's kind of a miracle morning type process. And when I do it, I benefit from it all day. I just have a dog as well, so she is not so tolerant of my rituals. She just licks my face when I'm meditating or will just jump on me. Yeah, she's the best. Well, she's now my spiritual guide. She's like, let's go to the dog park now.
Yes. Yes. And I've heard that the DOG has replaced the GOD.
Yes.
For some people. Yeah. I've heard that.
She is a lifesaver for me.
That's awesome. So as we kind of wrap up here, I was wondering if you could talk about what recovery looks like for you now. And how long have you been on this journey?
Nearly it'll be 8 years in March. Recovery today is very different from when it first started. You know, I no longer go to a mutual aid meeting, but I'm not averse to going if I really wanted to. It looks like having therapy. Therapy is my pathway of recovery.
Okay.
And my spirituality and my process and friendships and writing and moving my body. It's about living an integrated life, and however that looks on a daily basis, it changes all the time. So it's really been about setting myself free, you know, learning to see who I am and communicating my thoughts and feelings, giving myself a voice. I think that was a big part of my recovery. You know, not sitting in a church basement, you know, what do they say? Take the cotton wool out of your ears and put it in your mouth.
I've never heard of that. Okay.
Yeah, it's a really common phrase, and actually it's really traumatizing for people who have a trauma background. It's not helpful. And I think, you know, like the piece around women having no self-esteem, I think it's really hard for us to have a voice too, you know, especially in a society that promotes a male voice over a female voice. You know, it's important to find your voice. You know, recovery is about not only awareness of who you are, but developing an identity, learning to really live in that person. Yeah, recovery is very different today and fluid. Still so much growth to do.
Oh, yeah. Yeah,
Right?
as with all of us.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for being on. And I want to ask you, where are the best ways that people can find you and a lot of the awesome work that you're doing?
They can find me on my website, livsrecoverykitchen.com, and on social media by that name. My writing is featured in The Fix, Stat News, Filter Magazine, but they're all linked on my website and on my social media pages. So that's the best way to keep up to date with what I'm writing about.
Great. Well, thanks again, Liv.
Thank
Bye.
you. It was great talking to you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsandrecovery.com.